We're going to be talking about a topic that has become somewhat near and dear to my heart. I fortunately or unfortunately have a need to dig through the federal acquisition regulations on a frequent basis based upon what I do. As David indicated, I'm and I guess I can advance the slide as I do this. So I am in the government contracts practice group at my law firm, Thompson, Hine, and as part of what I do, the regulatory piece of it is paramount. I spend an awful lot of time not only digging through the federal acquisition regulations, but also the supplementary agency regulations, which, while they cannot contradict what the FAR tells procuring officials to do and corresponding contractors who perform work for the government to do, it does complement the FAR, and the changes to the FAR, which we're going to talk about today, and the FAR sort of generally will trickle down to the agencies and have an effect on the agencies as well. And we're not going to really touch too much on the agencies. I'll talk about them in passing as part of the overall changes that we're going to discuss today. But it's important to understand that there's layers of regulations that are impacted by what we're going to talk about today. And all these layers, by the way, are part of the reason why the changes themselves are taking place. Okay, so let's sort of dive in. This is sort of the overall, let me get this out of here. This is sort of our overall theme that we're going to be sort of walking through and discussing today. When the new administration came in January, almost immediately following the inauguration, you began to see executive order after executive order after executive order. It was somewhat unprecedented. And as a government contracts practitioner, I can tell you that this was unbelievably interesting to me, sort of going through all the various different executive orders as they were being issued. I couldn't read them fast enough. One of them I'll actually mention at some point, other than the one that we're going to talk about here primarily. I'll mention to you because it's of interest based upon all of the regulatory changes that are also taking place. But one of the most interesting that came out was the one that was entitled Restoring Common Sense to Federal Procurement, which was issued by President Trump on April the 15th, 2025. And the point of this executive order was to consolidate, to simplify the federal acquisition regulations such that the buying and selling of things by the government is easier. So the FAR has been around for 40 plus years. And over the course of that 40-year period of time, what we've seen is this continual addition to it. You don't find subtraction from it, but you do find addition to it. And that's been the steady theme since the 80s when it first, was assembled. And it used to be back in the day when I was first practicing. I'm in my 29th year of practice now. But at the beginning, whenever there was a change, you would get something in the mail, and you would see it would be a supplement to the FAR, and you'd stick it underneath the section that you already had. And if you wanted to understand what the changes were, you had to read the original version and then compare it to all the different changes that were made over the course of time. And of course, that changed when Al Gore invented the internet. And we have now electronic versions of the FAR, which are much more user-friendly. They're still very cumbersome and difficult to navigate, hence what we're going to talk about today. And what we're going to talk about today has been identified as a major shift in federal procurement policy. It's effectively getting back to the beginning. Sort of generally speaking, what the FAR represents is the roadmap for federal procuring officials to buy and sell things, whether they're goods or services, And to the effect that you wish to work for the federal government as a contractor, you need to understand this roadmap, if you will, because certain provisions of it could directly apply to you. Most of the time, the way that that works is once the government hires you to provide a service for it or wants to buy something from you and issues you a contract or a purchase order of some kind, portions of the federal acquisition regulations will be flowed down to you as part of that document that you sign, that contract that you sign with the government. So it's important, not simply from a government agency perspective to understand the FAR and its supplemental agency regulations, but it's also important as the contractor to understand how the regulations apply to you. What we're seeing as part of what's transpiring here is, as a result of this executive order, is the FAR and the agency supplements that I referred to being pared down and simplified and getting down to what the executive order calls and subsequent memoranda call its statutory roots. So the way that the procurement system, and this is not supposed to be administrative law 101, but just sort of generally speaking, the way it works is generally Congress says, hey, here's a law. Now executive agency, go figure it out and do something with it. And what oftentimes will result is the agencies that are involved in that legislative issuance by Congress will have to digest what Congress has issued and then issue regulations to move forward with those functions that that particular agency needs to perform consistent with whatever that legislation is. Sometimes it's very easy for the agency to understand what it's supposed to do. Congress is very specific. Do this. It really isn't much for the agency to do. Okay, I guess I have to do that. Sometimes the agency has to interpret what Congress is telling it to do and issues regulations consistent with that law. And when it does so, those proposed regulations end up in the Federal Register, and there's a note and comment period consistent with what we call the Administrative Procedures Act, and off you go. What this is attempting to do, and what we'll get into momentarily, is to get back to the statutory part of implementing what's necessary, what the government deems necessary through congressional means, and getting away from the over-regulatory part of implementing what Congress desires. So that's sort of what this is based in. And I don't know if I made that more complicated than it needs to be, but what's interesting is the executive order makes it real simple and wants to make the FAR real simple. How you get there is more complicated than it is simple, and that's what we'll get into. But the ultimate goal is to create a more agile, effective, and efficient procurement system, as we state here. And all of this is called the RFO, which is the parlance that all of us have accepted at this point, which is short for the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul. Okay, so current FAR, over 2,000 pages long. And it used to be, back in the old days, before, again, Al Gore invented the internet, you'd have a whole conference table full of FAR parts. Okay, there are 52 different FAR parts, and FAR 52 itself is very, very dense. FAR 52 being the contractual provisions that are often flowed down into the contracts that contractors engage in with their government counterparts that often flow from other parts of the FAR. But you have 2,000 pages of regulations that the FAR consists of presently, and the idea is to pare that down, make it simpler, at least in large part. That's what the reason for the executive order is and the current undertaking. As we state here, the mandate from the executive order is to eliminate all FAR provisions, and I will tell you before we get into this, that no FAR provision has in total been eliminated yet. We'll see if that actually occurs, but portions of them have been. But it mandates elimination of all FAR provisions that are not required by statute. Sometimes that's easy to determine. Sometimes that's not. We'll talk about that a little bit. That are not essential to sound procurement and that are not necessary to protect economic or national security interests. Those second two prongs, which are identified in the executive order, are a little harder to determine because they're not defined. What's essential to sound procurement? I think I know, but the executive order doesn't identify what that is. Same as it relates to economic or national security interests. So the only way we're going to really find out what that means as identified in the executive order and its following memoranda, one issued by FAR Council, one issued by OMB, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment, is to sort of see how things are defined as they move forward, which is primarily, as we'll see, something that we'll have to discern through exactly what the changes are. And we're going to talk about some of those changes, all of the changes really, that have been instituted thus far. For those, and this was actually, and subsequently in the memoranda that followed, further, I'll say codified, but for those provisions that are deemed non-statutory, but kept in the FAR. So it's not something that was specifically required by statute, but through the revision process has been deemed essential and necessary. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will forever be deemed essential and necessary. Every 4 years, based upon the executive order and the memoranda that followed, all non-statutory provisions will be reviewed to determine whether or not they will continue to stay in the FAR as part of the regulatory guidance for both the government and for contractors that work for the government. So this process, it will be an ongoing process that effectively doesn't end and will continue to get reviewed over the course of time. Okay, and as we were just talking about, there's not any clear criteria in the executive order itself or the memoranda that followed, which identify precisely what essential or necessary means. And by way of example, mandatory disclosure requirements, something incredibly important as part of what I do. There are mandatory disclosure requirements that get flowed down in virtually every or certainly many of the contracts that are performed by government contractors for the government. If they're not deemed to be statutorily required, which they're specifically not, then what happens if, for example, FAR 52.203.13 identified here is removed? What requirements are left for the contractor performing for a particular agency as it relates to anything that might be or fall within the realm of a potential mandatory disclosure, at least as we understand that today, to be determined. Rule of 2, FAR Part 19, small business programs. That's a FAR provision which has not yet been revised through the current process that the FAR is going through. But it's a FAR provision that I find myself in all the time. I do a lot of small business procurement work, and the regulations, the FAR, the SBA's regulations, they're pretty dense. They've changed many times, and I constantly find myself in them. But will the Rule of 2, for example, make the cut as part of the revision process? There's been an awful lot of discussion about that. We'll get into that a little bit as we get into the FAR provisions that have already gone through or are going through active changes. But what the Rule of 2 essentially says is that as part of the market research that an agency does, it should determine whether at least 2 small businesses have the ability to perform the work that assuming it's to service, that the government is seeking or will seek through the issuance of a solicitation of some kind. And if through that market research, the answer is yes, then what the government should do is set that opportunity aside for small business. And there are different types of small businesses, 8A, WSB, SDVOSB, et cetera. That is not a specific requirement, statutory requirement. It is a mechanism by which another statutory requirement seeks to, there's another statutory requirement that led to the rule of two, which may or may not allow for or be deemed enough for purposes of mandating its continued existence as we move forward. We don't know. We don't know. So we don't know whether it will or whether it will not make the cut. So these are the sorts of things that as folks that operate in this area, we have to start thinking about and anticipating moving forward. But the lack of clarity on issues like this, certainly, particularly if you talk about the rule of two and you're a small business, raises an eyebrow in terms of what the expectations should be moving forward. Proposed timeline. Okay, not surprisingly, it's aggressive. Everything the current administration does is on the aggressive side, at least from a timing perspective, and sometimes otherwise. But what we see here is the timeline that's been identified either through the executive order or OMB or FAR Council memoranda that have followed. We've already seen some of these things take place. We've already seen agencies, maybe not the folks that are listening, but for someone like me, it's very clear that all of what we see in the first section there all the way to the left on your slide has already taken place. So agencies have already identified their senior procurement officials to assist in working on these issues. And we know that at least in part based upon what we've seen published by the administration. And if you want to see this sort of happen in real time, what I encourage everyone to do is make sure that you understand where you can find it. And you can find it really, this part is easy. If you go to acquisition.gov, which is where I find myself at some point almost every day, not simply for purposes of this, but just to scroll through the FAR, you'll find at acquisition.gov an electronic version of the FAR. And on the very first page, on the home page, you'll see a button at the top of the screen, which will direct you to all of the various different changes that we're talking about today. Okay, you can click on the button and it will drive you to a page which will give you the executive order, the OMB memoranda that have been issued, the FAR Council memoranda that have been issued, all of the changes that have been implemented to date. Obviously, we're going to get into that momentarily. It will also provide you access to what they call practitioner guides. So, and these guides are for agency procurement officials to assist them in proceeding with procurements based upon the various different changes that have made. So if you go to acquisition.gov and you click on the button center top, you will be able to find all of what we're talking about and all of the correlating memoranda and other information to help explain exactly what's happening. The second box that you see going from left to right, the guidance that's identified here was in fact issued by OMB, so that's already occurred. The middle box, if you will, okay, this is where you start getting into a really aggressive territory, if you will. So what they're proposing, what the administration has proposed is to complete the FAR overhaul by mid-October. And based upon everything that we're hearing, the idea would be, okay, we finish by mid-October. We get final rule changes implemented between October and the end of the year. So you go through a more formal rulemaking process, and voila, by 2026, it's done. I think that's overly aggressive. What we've seen trickle out so far is a handful of revisions to the FAR. They haven't been coming out fast and furious. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't, a bunch of them won't come out all at one time. Everyone is waiting for that to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But the idea is the administration wants to go through this entire process in approximately, 1 year's time. So the memoranda that I just alluded to is discussed here. So on May 2, 2025, so a few short weeks after the executive order was issued by President Trump, the Office of Management and Budget issued its memoranda identifying the process by which all of this is going to take place. It's going to be a two-phase process, and we're in the middle of phase one now. The phase one process includes the immediate impact that all of what's taking place will look like, right? So what's happening is each FAR section, and they're taking it one FAR section at a time, will go through a revision process. That revision process, once it's complete, will be advertised on acquisition.gov and then immediately implemented, which is different. So before a rulemaking process, a formal rulemaking process, which is necessitated by the Administrative Procedures Act, there's a deviation process which will allow the immediate implementation of each one of the changes that are occurring, and we're going to talk about the ones that have already taken place. So the ones that we're going to talk about have already been revised, and for new procurements moving forward, they will be applicable. Now, as a practitioner, I wonder whether or not contracting officers are going to be prepared such that they're going to appropriately implement each one of the things that we're going to speak about, and then some, as more and more are issued. And I have no idea how contracting officers are being taught, in terms of how to do this, but that's what the intent is. It's immediate effect, and that's sort of phase one. And the phase two part of this, which is identified in the memoranda, is the actual rulemaking process that, based upon the timeline we just looked at, is supposed to take place at the end of the year. And we're hearing all sorts of rumors about how that's going to take place. I mean, normally you have a relatively, I'll say, long time period where the public can provide comment to any sort of regulatory change. So it goes in the Federal Register. There's some period of time, 60, 90, 120 days, which is often extended to allow the public additional time to comment before a final rule regulation is then officially implemented. We're hearing that that's not going to happen here. We're hearing that the rulemaking process, which will be part of phase two, is going to be a truncated process of 30 days or less. Don't know if that's actually going to happen or not. This is just simply what I'm hearing through the folks that I know in government who I've known for a long time. Part of the implementation roadmap that's identified with OMB includes what you see here, these buying guides. So for those provisions that are being removed from the FAR, in many cases, they are going to be housed, or portions of them will be housed within these buying guides, which will also be located on acquisition.gov. And if you go on the landing page for that, you'll see a place for it. There's nothing there yet, but you'll see a place for it. And eventually these buying guides will be used as a tool for government agency personnel as part of the procurement process. Now, from a practitioner's perspective, I don't know what that really means. I don't know if, for example, something that is used or not used that's in a buying guide could end up being the subject of a protest or something that's used as part of a protest to a solicitation or an award. Um, Probably not, because they're probably not going to be binding in any way, but we'll have to see sort of how that evolves over the course of time. So the buying guides, in addition to the streamlined FAR, as identified in the OMB memoranda, collectively, they're being called strategic acquisition guidance. And the whole idea here is to provide as much flexibility as possible for contracting officers and other contracting officials to buy things that the government needs.
Ed, let me interrupt you right there. We have a question from Dennis Martinez.
Yes.
Will these memoranda be pushed through available subscriptions, or do designated officials need to always just check for them or changes to FAR?
Yeah, so not clear to me how, if I'm understanding the question correctly, how agency officials are being told about the changes. Now, I assume they probably do the same thing that I do at the very least. I check every day. Hey, did a new one come out? So I wake up each morning, click, just to see if there's been anything new that's been issued. Now, I also get, legal publications that come out every morning. And so if I miss something or if I don't check a particular morning, which would be unusual, I'll get fed this information through the legal periodicals, which, show up in my inbox. And I assume that the very same thing is happening on the government side. Now, I will tell you that the head procurement attorney for an agency that I will not name asked me a couple of weeks ago whether a particular FAR provision had gone through any changes yet. And I said to him, Joe, are you kidding me? I should be asking you. Why are you asking me? And he said, I don't even want to talk about it. So I don't know how all of that is being handled internally by the government. But I do know that there's an awful lot of chatter about and attorneys talk, whether it's a government lawyer or a private practitioner, if we're all in the same circle and we talk to one another. And I've kept, good relationships with my government partners who I deal with all the time. And this is the sort of thing that's happening that, I have, at least in this one particular instance, a guy calling me, hey, Ed, did you hear anything about this? So I don't know how organized it is. And this is, sort of anecdotal, what I'm conveying. But I can tell you from a public facing perspective, everybody on the call has the ability to do exactly what I do and hop on acquisition.gov and see it sort of happen in real time. And there've been in one of the memoranda that had been issued, I recall whether it's OMB or FAR Council, it was one or the other, telling government procurement people to go there to look. That doesn't mean that they're not getting the information otherwise, but it means that a lot of the same ways that we can find out the information, government personnel are being told that that's how they can get the information as well. I hope that answered the question. If it didn't, interrupt me again and let me know.
I've got a follow-up here from the corporate side. We're not all attorneys, but engineers, directors, and logistics. Even as CFO, I need to know how to stay ahead of this, as there is huge lag between our export focals. And I imagine this applies to a lot of our members.
Yeah, I mean, staying ahead of it is what we're all trying to do.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult. I'm telling you, the best thing that you can do is what I just suggested. You got to check for yourself. There could be, and it's easy. I mean, acquisition.gov is very user-friendly. I've been using it for years just to navigate the FAR itself. It's hypertext linked. It's easy to find. Once you find the landing page for the RFO, it's easy. You can go there, you can click, you can see which agencies have updated have issued deviations consistent with their agency regulations also. So you can click on, there's a drop-down menu, and you can see, and in each instance, you'll see all of the, I don't think there's any, I haven't seen anything different other than this. So every single agency for every single change so far has issued a deviation as part of their own regulations, implementing everything sort of from the bottom up. So all these things are moving forward, and the best way to follow it is as I suggested to you. Just I would check each morning. Just check and see. It'll only take you 5 minutes, unless unless one dropped, and then it might take you a little bit longer. But then hopefully you have somebody who operates in this area who you can hey, what the heck is this? Somebody like that who can provide you some feedback. So here's the in the memoranda that I just referenced. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because I just went through it. Here are the phase 1, phase 2 aspects of it, right? So I won't spend a lot of time on that. And then, as far as the class deviations are concerned, so that what we just discussed was the OMB memorandum. FAR Council, which is what's identified here, also issued its own memorandum on the same day that OMB did, and basically told all the agencies how and when they're required to issue their specific agency deviations to implement for each of the individual agencies what we're talking about here. And this kind of goes to the immediacy of how these things are being implemented. And then the formal rulemaking piece, which is on the end, is a separate matter altogether. But FAR Council issued this on May 2nd, same day as OMB. Off we go, right? All right, so now let's start talking about some of the changes that have taken place thus far. Okay, so you would think FAR Part 1 would be a good place to start. And guess what? That's where they started. Then it changes. Okay, but anyway, so they start with FAR Part 1. And for FAR Part 1, what they basically did was repackage it. And for a number of the changes that have been made so far, not all, and we'll get into some where that's different, but for a number of the changes that have been made, it's been a repackaging of sorts. So that's sort of what you see here, where while some of the guiding principles surrounding the FAR have been removed, most of them have been just simply relocated elsewhere. The FAR Part 1 guidance really is 30,000-foot guidance for agencies in terms of how they're supposed to go through the procurement process. Not a heck of a lot of impact for those of us on the call here. And again, a lot of it was simply a repackaging of information. And there's also, and you see this a number of times, and we'll see it as we go through, this whole concept of redundancy. So a number of times, what has been said as part of the revision process is, well, the information here is redundant and is repeated elsewhere, which is why it's being eliminated here. You don't need 2,000 pages of regulations. Part of the reason you have 2,000 pages of regulations is because you have all this redundancy. And so you'll see a lot of that as far as an explanation is concerned in terms of why certain things are being removed, but not anything all that earth-shattering here. Okay, so what they're talking, okay, so as part of the rulemaking process, and this actually it happens or is happening quite a bit as we go through too. So a lot of times what the FAR will do is provide sort of a step-by-step process by which a contracting officer or other contracting government contracting authority must go through or should go through for purposes of buying something, or mechanisms by which that procurement official should issue a procurement or solicitation. And in certain circumstances, the details associated with how to go about doing that are eliminated or are being eliminated as part of the rewrite. And some of that happened as part of the rulemaking that was previously set forth in FAR Part 1. And you see some of that identified here. Part of the reason that they did that, and you'll see that sort of in the middle of the slide here, is because they effectively said, look, we really don't need to lay out in detail how to do it, because we're just telling you, government official, they need to follow 41 USC 1707, the Administrative Procedures Act, right? The problem, and this is a sort of an overarching problem that government folks have expressed to me about this, and the same thing will hold true for the contracting community, I'm sure, and for practitioners. When you're used to going to the FAR to understand what all these procedures are, and they're no longer there, there's only a reference to a statutory provision. Well, where am I going to find that? So there's going to be sort of this learning curve about that's going to have to take place, and we're all going to have to participate in, such that we go from this regulatory landing spot, which we're accustomed to, acquisition.gov, for example, to some other place. Now, if everything is hypertext linked, like it always has been with acquisition.gov, maybe it's not so bad, okay? Because I can just click on 41 USC 1707 in the revised FAR. I can go there and I find the information there. Extra step, maybe unnecessary, maybe even a little bit silly. Why not just keep it there? But part of the process that we're seeing is exactly as I've sort of identified it. Okay. Okay, so let's go over to FAR Part 6. So the next section, FAR Part 6, you found the changes to FAR Part 6. They were actually recently issued June 27th. So this is one of the more recent changes, and it removes, this particular change removes explicit references to small business and socioeconomic set-asides pertaining to 8A companies, WOSBs, SDVOSBs, et cetera, which was embedded within FAR Part 6, and has specifically indicated as part of the rule change that agency heads and contracting officers have the discretion to go through a process by which to limit competition consistent with the socioeconomic and small business set-asides that were previously identified as FAR Part 6, but the mandates, the boilerplate mandates that were, I call them boilerplate mandates, the mandates that were in this particular provision of the FAR have been eliminated and identified as being discretionary. Now, what this doesn't talk about, because it's in a separate part of the FAR, are the requirements of FAR Part 19 and how, which is specifically pertaining to small business and the small business programs. This doesn't say anything about what impact the changes that we're talking about will ultimately have on FAR Part 19. All it is doing is eliminating those references as part of the competition requirements in FAR Part 6. So is it, just simply a matter of it being duplicative? Probably, because what we'll end up ultimately seeing is what is statutory and otherwise required as it relates to this, as part of what occurs or happens to FAR Part 19. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. And I alluded to it earlier, talked about it earlier, that sometimes these changes are simply for the purpose of eliminating the duplicative nature of the FAR itself. You find things in different provisions and you're constantly going back and forth. It's to eliminate at least some of that And that's what we're seeing, at least in part, here. The other thing that has, and I mentioned it earlier, that has created an awful lot of buzz in the small business contracting community is, okay, well, does this signal an end to the rule of two, which we talked about a little while ago? We don't know yet. The rule of two itself is not a statutory creature in and of itself. It was created for the purpose of achieving a result. So will that rule of two survive in some way in some other section of the FAR, i.e. part 19? And there's been an awful lot of discussion writing about that, sort of to be determined. The overall emphasis of FAR Part 6, which is full and open competition, consistent with the Competition in Contracting Act, which is statutory. It remains as part of FAR Part 6 and the changes to FAR Part 6. There are additional provisions and changes pertinent to times where something other than full and open competition is permissible. And many of those instances, not anything crazy new and different. There are, emergency and compelling urgency provisions that are, you see one identified here for 6.103-2, for example, where other than full and open competition is permissible. You have renewed justification and approval provisions that have become part of FAR Part 6, and you see the threshold values here pertaining to when a J&A is necessary, when a contracting officer or other procurement personnel wishes to use something other than full and open competition. That's new, so it's something to be aware of. But J&As have always been around. You're just seeing them being used a little bit differently based upon the revisions that we're seeing as part of here, as part of FAR Part 6 and the changes to FAR Part 6. FAR Part 10. So FAR Part 10 actually came before FAR Part 6, and there's no rhyme or reason as to the various different changes that we're seeing in the timing of them. But FAR Part 10 pertains to market research and the requirements that contracting personnel on the government side must go through for purposes of determining how to solicit for the goods and services that it needs. And as part of the changes, not unlike many of the other changes and the RFO, generally speaking, the OFPP and FAR Council have determined that a number of these provisions had to be removed. The old provisions had to be removed because they were, as you see here, outdated, redundant, or otherwise unnecessary. And you'll see examples of those here. Now, of concern to me as a practitioner, there's a reference to, you see right in the middle there, consolidation and bundling of requirements and problems associated with that. When requirements are bundled, they become less apt to be appropriate for smaller businesses. So there's a tendency when the government bundles requirements to eliminate competition through small business. And so the issue of consolidation and bundling has been something that, folks in my field have been talking about for an awfully long time. And those requirements or those regulatory provisions that were a part of FAR Part 10 have been eliminated. Now, what they're saying here is the reason that they've been eliminated here is because they're elsewhere. So there's this whole redundancy issue that is a reason or a big reason why the FAR itself is being updated. So it's not that they've been eliminated in total. What they've simply done here is say, hey, look, as part of the market research process, we don't need to talk about it here because it's discussed elsewhere. So there's been sort of this consolidation, if you will, as part of what they did with the revisions to FAR Part 10. Now, some of the other provisions that have been removed, there were policy statements for market research on contingency, defense, and disaster relief operations. All of that was eliminated. Procedural guidance on techniques, use of systems like SAM and FPDS, that was eliminated. That was, I thought, sort of useful for contracting officials, but it's been eliminated, and the reason is to give them more flexibility in terms of how they want to conduct their market research. Procedural guidance on are pertaining to the requirements related to sustainable acquisitions, customary practices, consolidation, bundling, which we just talked about, and that sort of thing. All of that has been eliminated, again, for the purpose of providing additional freedom of the contracting personnel that are responsible for issuing solicitations to do what they deem sufficiently appropriate to buy and sell, or buy, rather, the goods and services that the government is seeking. Some new additions you see here to FAR Part 10 market research. As part of the market research process, the agencies continue to be encouraged to do outreach in the community, but there's also sort of this emphasis on not doing too much, right? Only doing what is absolutely necessary for purposes of reaching some sort of a final resolution on how to proceed. Okay, so while industry engagement is still discussed as part of FAR Part 10, it's sort of downplayed. So something to keep in mind as you sort of look at the revisions and the impact of them. Okay, let's switch over to FAR Part 11, describing agency needs. For FAR Part 11, this was a more recent one. This one came out on June 18th, 2025. As part of this, what agencies are being told to do in sort of more general terms is to express their needs in terms of functions to be performed, performance required, or essential characteristics. Sort of broad brush. Okay, hey, this is what we need in particular, or as it relates to a particular service or goods that they're intending to purchase or need to purchase in some way. So eliminating more of the sort of specific requirements and making it more sort of broad brushed in terms of what's necessary for the agency. And here is what I just mentioned: functions to be performed, performance required, essential physical characteristics of the item or service that the government is intending to purchase. There's also within FAR Part 11 and the revisions to them, the concept of sustainability and the importance of sustainability, which has sort of survived the rewrite process. So that's something to keep in mind as well. FAR Part 18, emergency acquisitions, another new revision. This one hit acquisition.gov on June 12, 2025. And this one, this is sort of a significant rewrite, and the purpose of which is to streamline emergency contracting for the government. Most of the procedural sections of this particular part of the FAR have been removed, leaving only what's essential. So you see on the left-hand part of the screen here what's been removed, and on the right-hand part of the screen you'll see what they've sort of put in its place, at least in part. The idea is focused on flexibility and the ability for contracting personnel to work in an environment where things can happen very quickly. There are certain things, like pursuant to the Stafford Act, which is, of course, is statutory, that remained as part of the rewrite. And under the Stafford Act, if there's a for example, hurricane relief that's necessary in North Carolina. The emphasis should be on retaining local contractors to perform that work. It's quicker, it's better for the community that's been affected, and it's a statutory requirement, so that remained. A lot of the other requirements did not remain. You have, and you see here, the ability under certain circumstances to heighten the simplified acquisition threshold, SAT, for purposes of making acquisitions faster, move faster in emergency situations. And we actually saw that happen during COVID. The SAT was raised for purposes of assisting contracting personnel to move things along in a more effective, efficient way during the pandemic. And you're seeing the codification of that, if you will, here as part of FAR Part 18 in the rewrite to FAR Part 18. There's an emphasis on, as part of all of what is happening here, on the purchase of commercial products or commercial services. So the government is not reinventing the wheel. Big emphasis. And we're seeing an awful lot of that in terms of the consolidation of purchasing, which is sort of a separate animal, and I won't really get into it, but there's this desire for the government to use GWACs and to purchase things using existing contracting vehicles and buying goods and services that are commercial in nature and not made strictly for a government purpose. If it's out in the commercial marketplace and it can serve the needs of the government, that's the way to go. And that's what this particular administration is pushing. And you see that in a lot of the rewrites. You see here, as part of FAR Part 18, a reference to practitioner album highlights. These practitioner albums have been issued as part of most of the rewrites that have been done thus far, and it's for the purpose, kind of like the buying guides, it's for the purpose of assisting contracting personnel in proceeding with the mandates that are identified in connection with each one of these rewrites. Okay, so maybe there's not a specific reg that might pertain to something that the contracting officer may wish to do, but the practitioner album that is associated with that particular rewrite would assist the contracting officer in terms of how to proceed under a particular circumstance. Taxes, I'm not going to spend a lot of, even though I'm with a group who might be very interested in taxes, but effectively, so FAR Part 29 did go through a rewrite process. From my perspective, when I get involved in FAR Part 29, it's typically, as it relates to tax exemptions, the government has sovereign immunity as it relates to state and local tax, and there are tax exemptions that the federal government is entitled to as part of that the supremacy clause concept, which I just referred to. And then there are instances where contractors purchasing on behalf of the government can also receive those exemptions, but there are all sorts of issues associated with those, and different states sometimes treat them differently. The big takeaway from the changes to FAR Part 29 are the ones that you see right here. There's now a mandate that contracting officers consult with agency counsel as it relates to tax pertinent issues and how to reduce cost by making sure that any exemptions that can be obtained are obtained. And that's effectively what you're seeing as part of the second mandate identified on our page here. FAR Part 31. So FAR Part 31, cost principles, important to the folks on this call, largely untouched. There have been some changes to language, but as it relates to allocability, allowability, reasonableness, none of those things change. So for those of you who deal with FAR Part 31 and cost principles, you'll be happy to know that it's largely unchanged, and that has to do with the statutory acquisition process. At least that's how it's been identified. So no real heavy changes there. FAR Part 34, there have been some changes. FAR Part 34 pertains to major system acquisition, which I don't get terribly involved in. Like usually you're talking about weapon systems and things like that. There have been some changes to earned value management systems and integrated baseline review. To the extent that, folks have questions specific to that, you can always, feel free to reach out to me. I am going to make these slides available, but for anybody who does deal in FAR Part 34 major systems acquisition, there have been some changes. You see them identified here. There have been some updates and a relaxation of some of the requirements. So to the extent that you do work in weapons acquisition systems, I encourage you to hop on acquisition.gov and sort of check that out. One of the most recent changes here maybe it was 2-3 weeks ago, were the changes to FAR Part 39, and it changed from the acquisition of IT, okay, to now ICT. So it's not just information technology, it's information and communication technology. This is a big deal for this particular administration. So there's an emphasis on modular and being able to build upon and like sort of smaller increments. That's sort of modular development and acquisition of technology based products is something that's emphasized as part of FAR Part 39. This one I haven't dug into a ton yet, but I'm starting to. It's new. And it's something that those of you that are involved in IT, now ICT, you should be aware of. I encourage you all again to hop on acquisition.gov and sift through the changes that have been made to FAR Part 39. This three-phased evaluation process that you see here is new to FAR Part 39. And contracting personnel are being told to go through this particular process, as you see here, in connection with the purchase of ICT. I know we're getting short on time here. I'm just about wrapped up. So FAR Part 43, this is the last one I'm going to cover, contract modifications. Not any major changes to this particular FAR section. It's been modified slightly consistent with what you see here. It's been expanded slightly to include orders. But for the most part, the changes are not wholesale-wide crazy changes. They've been updated and refreshed, I'll say. That's probably the best way to sort of characterize it. So, sort of keep your eyes on the ball and what's happening. There haven't been a ton of these revisions that have been issued yet, but a ton more are coming, and very important ones: FAR Part 14, FAR Part 16, FAR Part 19, FAR Part 36. So keep your eyes on what's coming. Stay glued to acquisition.gov. To the extent that you do have any questions, I will make my slides available to you and encourage you to reach out to me independently. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And I'll stick around here as well.
So Ed, we do have one more question
Sure.
for Joe. He's asking, how are the exemption under 29 affecting tariffs?
I don't know that they are just yet. I mean, what we're talking about here, particular to that set of revisions, is brand new. And so I haven't heard anything yet about how all of that is impacting, how it is being impacted by tariffs. But you're seeing, deals and threats of tariffs happening almost on a daily basis. So I haven't heard of any impacts to that yet. But again, that's only because it's all so new. But to the extent that, I hear anything about that, I can pass it along to David and make sure that all of the members here are aware of that.
Bill Lee is asking, do any of the executive order changes require legislative action to be codified?
In certain circumstances, the answer is going to be yes. Now, in one of the memoranda that's already been issued, the OMB memoranda from May, there's there's an indication that they understand that it's going to be necessary. They don't know the extent to which it's going to be necessary, but they anticipate, they anticipated and continue to anticipate that there's going to be the need for at least some congressional action. It all depends on how far some of these rewrites are going to go, but there is an anticipation that some congressional action is going to be necessary, and I would anticipate seeing that sometime around October.